Hi folks, hope you're okay today. It's good to be with you and love to everybody out there. My website's jasonburnspreacher.com. I just want to share a few thoughts today concerning my debate with Mansur last Sunday. And I just want to share a few points from that debate. One thing is, I kept saying that the first century historians, Tacitus and Josephus, took their cue from 2nd century historian called Polybius. In that debate, there was a guy who was mocking, who said, you're making it up because you're on about the 2nd century, and that's like after the 1st century. So how can the 1st century historians taking their cue from the 2nd century historian? When I say 2nd century historian Polybius is a 2nd century BC. Alright, so Polybius was a 2nd century Greek historian of 2nd century BC, and this 2nd century BC historian, Polybius, said in order to write good history you've got to use eyewitness material, and so he was a household name when it comes to historians in the 1st century AD. Alright, so unless you're going to Google Polybius and find out about him, that would be lost in the debate with Mansur. Secondly, Mansur in the debate talks about the criteria for the cross is the same as the criteria for the resurrection. Secular scholars don't believe in the resurrection, so why should we believe in Jesus dying on a cross? This seems a very legitimate argument that he makes, but it's not a legitimate argument because there's a number of issues there that are not similar. Number one, historical Jesus study scholars from Dominic Crossan to N.T. Wright to many others, they all use criteria, but those criteria they use in different combinations and in different ways. So it's not true to say that the criteria that historians use to verify the cross is the same criteria used to verify the resurrection, because every scholar uses criteria in different combinations and in different ways, and also interprets the criteria in different ways. So the criteria of multiple attestation, the criteria of dissimilarity, for example, every scholar will interpret those criteria in their own way. There's no general consensus on any of those criteria. That's really important. So when scholars come to the idea that Jesus Christ died on the cross, they're using the criteria in different ways, in different combinations, but they all come to that general same conclusion that Christ died on the cross. Now the next point is on the resurrection. On the resurrection, it's a different issue than the cross. On the resurrection, there's a clear implication of a miracle. So scholars are very reticent to say there's a resurrection taking place because obviously their presupposition is they don't believe in a miraculous event anyway, it could ever happen. So Mansur touches on this, but he doesn't elaborate on the significance of this and that it deconstructs his own position. So the scholars that use the variety of criteria and the variety of way they, in combination that they like, they come to the resurrection, and most scholars will come to the conclusion that the early church believed in a resurrection. The scholars don't believe a resurrection took place, but many scholars such as Dale Allison and Dominic Crossan, even Bart Ehrman, many will grant you that the early church believed in a resurrection, that they felt that they saw a resurrection. Now, scholars will not necessarily say a resurrection took place, but for someone like Dale Allison, for example, who's probably one of the greatest, one of the top scholars in historical Jesus studies, they will grant you that the early church believed in a resurrection. Okay, so Mansur is not really in touch with the scholarship. He's not in touch with the academic work that's been done on the resurrection by historical Jesus study scholars. So to equate the same criteria, so number one, when Mansur says the same criteria for verifying the cross is the same criteria for verifying the resurrection, the scholars don't believe in the resurrection, so it's arbitrary. Why do they believe in the cross? So number one, criteria is much more complex than he realizes. Every scholar uses criteria in their own mix, in their own way, interprets it their own way. So you can't say they do it for the cross here and they do it for the resurrection here. You can't say that in a blanket statement. Scholars are varied in their approaches. Okay, that's number one. Number two, it's a false parallel to say the resurrection and the cross are the same in terms of verification. It's clearly stated through the resurrection there's a miracle, and so the problem is that scholars, when they're looking at the resurrection, they might have strong evidence that the disciples believed in a resurrection, which most scholars agree with, but they won't go the next step and say a resurrection take place, because it's not because of the evidence, it's because of the naturalism, that they don't believe in miracles. So they stop short of saying a miracle took place. But the evidence that the disciples believed in a resurrection is there. So I hope that clears up. So number one, Polybius is 2nd century BC. Okay, go and do some research on that. Number two, scholars use criteria in their own various ways, in their own various combinations. So you've got to be careful in making generalities, saying they do the same for the cross as they do for the resurrection. No, they don't. It's much more complex than Mansur realizes. And number three, there is evidence for the resurrection from secular scholars. They do see that the early church believed in a resurrection, but they stop short in saying a physical resurrection took place, not because of the evidence, but because of the principles of naturalism, where they don't believe in miracles have taken place anyway, no matter what evidence you give them. Alright? So I hope that clears up some of the issues that Mansur said. I graciously give him the opportunity to debunk me at the end, and I let him have that opportunity. The other thing I wanted to pick up on at the end of the debate, which I would have liked to, is he talked about using scholars like Bart Ehrman and that verify my position, and then in other areas like the resurrection don't verify. The thing is, Muslim scholars like Mansur, even though he didn't use it this time, do often bring up Bart Ehrman and do try to use Bart Ehrman to refute Christianity. And so the reason why I brought up Bart Ehrman is, when it comes to the cross, he's on the side of Christianity and not on the side of Islam. And so, in other words, the Muslims can choose the scholars that they want to suit their position, but the reality is these scholars would not agree with Islam concerning some of the fundamental issues of Christianity, such as the cross of Jesus. In conclusion, basically, Mansur is a very intelligent man, but he's not widely read in this area. He's not widely studied in this area, and you can see his lack of information, his lack of understanding of these issues in the debate for those who more learned and read in this topic. Thank you for listening, and God bless. Don't forget, if you want to study this topic, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham is a very good place to start. And Bart Ehrman's book has written a book on the issue of eyewitnesses and the gospel. So those are the two books that you could read. And Gary Habermas' website is a very helpful website to research these issues. Thank you for listening, and God bless.